The year is 1944. The place, a sweltering hellscape called Peleliu. For the young Marines of the 1st Division, the enemy wasn't just the unforgiving heat or the razor-sharp coral. It was the deeply entrenched, fanatical soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army. They were ghosts in the jungle, masters of ambush, and their code, Bushido, demanded they fight to the death. In this brutal theater of war, every piece of equipment was a matter of life or death. The M1 Garand was the symphony of American firepower, a devastating rifle that dominated the battlefield. But the American sidearm, the standard-issue Colt M1911, was often met with Japanese ridicule. They called it a toy gun, scoffing at its relatively low muzzle velocity and the small .45 caliber round it fired. To them, the Nambu pistol, with its high-capacity magazine and swift-firing 8mm rounds, was a superior weapon. But on this island of blood and sacrifice, one Marine would prove them devastatingly wrong. He would show them that the power of the Colt wasn't in its sound or its speed, but in a quiet, brutal finality that no man could walk away from. The fight for Peleliu would become a proving ground, and the unassuming toy gun would write its own terrifying legend in the history of the Pacific War, of distant machine gun fire and explosions. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and sweat. The sun beat down on the coral beaches of Peleliu, its rays bouncing off the white sand and blinding the Marines as they waded ashore. It was a baptism of fire, a chaotic maelstrom of steel and blood that had been promised as a quick 3-day affair. Instead, it became one of the most savage battles of the Pacific War. Among the storm of landing craft and artillery shells was Sergeant Frank "Lucky" O'Hara, a lanky kid from Boston with a face too young for the lines etched around his eyes. He clutched his M1 Garand, its weight a familiar comfort, but his hand kept straying to the leather holster on his hip. Inside a Colt 45, his constant companion. Frank had a history with that pistol. Back on Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, the Garand was the primary dance partner, but the Colt was his last resort, his quiet final word in a close-quarters argument. The Marines landing on Peleliu were walking into a well-prepared death trap. Unlike the linear, beach-focused defenses they had come to expect, the Japanese had dug in. They had turned the island's natural coral caves into a labyrinth of tunnels and pillboxes, a fortress of interlocking fields of fire. General Kunio Nakagawa, the island's cunning commander, had abandoned the banzai charge for a more methodical, grinding defense. His men were ghosts, melting into the jungle, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were the masters of silence, of the surprise ambush. Frank's squad was tasked with pushing inland through a tangled mess of undergrowth and razor-sharp coral rock. They moved slowly, their senses on high alert. Every rustle of a leaf, every snapping twig was a potential sniper. The heat was a physical enemy, sapping their strength and making their already heavy packs feel like lead. Private Miller, a fresh-faced replacement who had just arrived, wiped sweat from his brow. "Sergeant, you ever seen anything like this?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Frank just shook his head. "Just keep your eyes open, Miller. Don't look at anything too long. The jungle's a tricky beast." Frank knew the truth. This was worse. This was an enemy that didn't want to die quickly. They wanted to take as many of them as possible with them. The American M1 Garand was a beautiful weapon, its ping of an empty clip a distinctive sound of American firepower. But in the close, twisting confines of the jungle, its length was a liability. It snagged on vines, and its thunderous report echoed, giving away a position in a heartbeat. This was a place where a sidearm was more than a backup. It was a necessity. Frank's squad was pinned down by a concealed machine gun nest. The enemy fire was relentless, stitching lines of dust and debris across the ground just inches from their heads. They tried to outflank the position, but every move was met with a new burst of fire. The air filled with the familiar high-pitched whiz of Japanese 8mm rounds. Frank signaled to his men to hold their position. He knew a frontal assault was suicide. He noticed a narrow, winding path that seemed to lead around the side of the ridge. It was a risk, but it was their only option. He pulled out his Colt 45. The weight of it in his hand felt different from the M1. It was compact, solid, a tool of intimate violence. He crawled forward, low to the ground, the coral scraping against his knees and forearms. As he rounded a bend, he saw the pillbox, a camouflaged, dirt-covered bunker with a narrow slit for the machine gun. 2 Japanese soldiers were manning the gun, their faces a mask of concentration. One had a Nambu pistol holstered on his hip, its grip a familiar shape. The Nambu, with its elegant wooden grips and its slim 8mm round, was a finely made weapon, but it was a testament to a different kind of combat. It was designed for speed, not stopping power. Frank raised his Colt. He took a deep breath, and as he prepared to engage, he noticed a 3rd Japanese soldier emerging from a nearby tunnel, a submachine gun slung over his shoulder. He was talking to the machine gunners, gesticulating wildly, and in his belt was a familiar pistol. Frank knew he had a split second to make a move, or all of his men would be cut to ribbons. He held his breath, the weight of the Colt feeling heavier than ever. He had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not just the fate of his men, but his own life. The shot from Frank's Colt 45 was a dull, heavy thud compared to the rapid chatter of the machine gun. It was a singular sound, a statement of intent. The Japanese soldier with the submachine gun, the one who had just emerged, dropped instantly, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. The 2 machine gunners turned, startled, their eyes wide with a mix of surprise and confusion. Frank squeezed the trigger again, the recoil a familiar jolt in his hand. The 1st machine gunner took a round to the torso and crumpled, his face a mask of disbelief. The 2nd raised his rifle, but Frank was already moving, sidestepping behind the pillbox's blind spot. He was no cowboy, no gunslinger from a B-movie. He was a Marine who understood the grim calculus of a firefight. He'd seen the Nambu in action on countless occasions. A Japanese soldier with a Nambu could put a half-dozen rounds into a man before he even knew what was happening. But Frank had also seen how a Marine with 3 or 4 8mm rounds in him could still charge, still fight, still kill. The Nambu's high-velocity 8mm round could pierce and tear, but it didn't have the brute, bone-shattering force of the Colt's 45 ACP. The Colt was a hammer, and the Nambu was a scalpel. And in the close, brutal confines of a jungle tunnel, a hammer was what you needed. The remaining Japanese soldier, the one who had turned to face Frank, had a moment of pure, unadulterated fear flash across his face. He lunged for his Nambu, but Frank's 3rd shot was already on its way. It hit him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled, trying to get a bead on Frank, but the Colt's 45 round had shattered his collarbone, throwing his aim completely off. Frank didn't hesitate. He took his 4th shot, and the Japanese soldier collapsed, his Nambu clattering to the ground. He was still alive, gasping for air, but the fight was over. Frank moved in, his boot on the machine gun. The firing from the enemy position had ceased. The silence was deafening, save for the panicked, shouted questions from his men. "Frank, you good?" Miller's voice. Frank didn't answer right away. He just knelt, his hand shaking slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The Colt felt cold and heavy in his hand. He hadn't just killed 3 men. He had stopped a storm of lead. The men emerged from their cover, their faces a mix of relief and awe. Miller stared at the fallen Japanese soldiers. He had seen men shot before, but there was something different about this. The way they had just gone down. It wasn't the theatrical falling of a movie. It was the sudden, brutal cessation of life. A final period at the end of a sentence. Frank returned to his squad, his face impassive. "We're clear," he said, his voice flat. But the encounter had left a mark. They had been in countless fights, but the sheer, instantaneous finality of the Colt's work had a profound effect. It wasn't a wound. It was a shut-off switch. The Japanese had a code of fighting to the death, and they were masters of it. They would take multiple rounds and still come at you with a bayonet. But the Colt 45 seemed to defy this code. A single, well-placed round could shatter a man's will to fight, his ability to fight, his life. The Japanese themselves had long held a kind of contempt for the American sidearm. On Guadalcanal, they had captured a few and had even fired them, scoffing at the slow, fat bullet, mocking its low velocity. The Nambu's 8mm round was a quick-stepping ballet dancer, and the Colt's 45 was a lumbering brute. But the brute had a devastating punch. As the Marines pushed further inland, they encountered more resistance. A sniper, hidden in a banyan tree, took down one of their men. The squad spread out, searching. Frank knew the sniper wouldn't just fire and retreat. He would hold his position, a defiant last stand. Frank saw a flicker of movement in the dense canopy above. He aimed his Colt. It felt instinctual. He fired a single round, a quiet bark in the humid air, a heavy thud from above, and then silence. A dead Japanese sniper fell to the ground, his face a look of surprised confusion. He had been shot through the head. The sheer power of the .45 round had ended the threat instantly, without a need for a second shot. This was a new kind of war, a war of inches and close-quarters combat. A war where the final arbiter of a fight was not the speed of a bullet, but its stopping power. And the Colt .45 was proving to be the undisputed heavyweight champion. But this was only the beginning. The caves and tunnels of Peleliu would become a proving ground for this unassuming pistol, a place where it would earn its reputation as a death sentence for anyone who faced its unforgiving muzzle. The Japanese were about to learn a brutal lesson about American firepower, and it would change the way they fought and the way they died. They thought the M1 was their primary enemy, but they were about to discover that the Colt was the one they should truly fear. The legend of the Colt .45 on Peleliu wasn't just built on a handful of encounters. It was a growing, terrifying truth that spread through the Marine ranks like wildfire. Frank "Lucky" O'Hara was a walking testament to its power. His reputation for quietly, efficiently neutralizing threats in the closed, twisting confines of the jungle grew with each passing day. The M1 Garand was for the big fights, the open fields of fire, the barrages of lead that hammered the enemy from a distance. But when the enemy was a ghost in a cave, a shadow behind a tree, the Colt was the answer. It was a tool of brutal, decisive violence that left no room for heroics or last stands. The Marines started to rely on their sidearms more, checking them, cleaning them, feeling the weight of them in their holsters. They began to see the Colt not just as a backup, but as a primary weapon for the kind of combat they were now facing. The psychological effect on the Japanese was equally profound. The initial arrogance, the dismissive scoffing at the toy gun, was slowly replaced by a grim, creeping fear. One of the most defining moments came in the brutal fight for Umabrogal Mountain, a jagged, coral ridge that the Marines had nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. The Japanese had turned this natural fortress into an impregnable stronghold. The caves were their homes, their barracks, their final resting places. Marines were dying in droves, trapped in a brutal war of attrition. Sergeant O'Hara's squad was part of a push to clear a series of interconnected caves. They were called kill zones for a reason. Japanese soldiers would wait in the darkness, letting a few Marines pass before unleashing a hail of gunfire from behind. The M1 was too long to use effectively in the cramped spaces. So, they relied on flamethrowers and grenades, and when that wasn't an option, they relied on their pistols. Frank and his men found a cave entrance, a narrow, dark opening barely wide enough for one man at a time. The air inside was thick and stale, a mix of dirt, human waste, and something else, the coppery smell of blood. Frank went in first, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. He held his Colt in his hand, the weight of it a solid reassurance. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on loose rock. The beam of his flashlight caught a glint of metal, a rifle barrel. He immediately dropped and fired a single round into the darkness. A sharp cry of pain, and then a heavy thud. He moved forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and found a Japanese soldier, his rifle unfired, a single devastating hole in his forehead. He hadn't even had time to raise his weapon. He had likely been waiting for the first man in to be well past his position before engaging, and the Colt's instantaneous power had caught him completely off guard. Frank's men followed, their faces pale in the flashlight beam. They moved deeper into the cave, a silent, tense procession. They found more bodies, Japanese soldiers who had been taken out in a silent, brutal dance. Frank had become a master of the one-shot kill. He would see a shadow, a silhouette, a flicker of movement, and the Colt would roar, and another enemy soldier would fall. The Japanese, with their Nambu pistols and their high-velocity 8mm rounds, were masters of a different kind of close-quarters fight. A fight of multiple rapid shots, of shock and awe. But the Colt was a fight ender. It didn't wound, it destroyed. They would aim for the body, the chest, the vital organs, and the sheer force of the 45 round would pulverize bone, tear tissue, and often stop a man in his tracks. Word began to filter back from the Japanese side. Stories, rumors of the American demon with the thunder gun. They knew the sound of the M1, the chatter of the Thompson submachine gun. But the deep, hollow roar of the Colt became a sound of fear. They started to instruct their men to aim for the Americans' hands to try to disarm them. They were no longer scoffing at the toy gun. They were terrified of it. They had seen what it could do. They had seen their hardened, fanatical soldiers, men who would charge into a wall of fire, drop instantly from a single quiet shot from a pistol. The Colt had become a symbol of American brutal efficiency. It didn't require fanfare. It just did its job, and it did it with a grim, devastating finality. And as the battle for Bloody Nose Ridge continued and the body count climbed, Frank O'Hara and his Colt 45 were about to have their biggest test yet. The Japanese had prepared a trap, a massive, interconnected network of tunnels and caves that were to be their final bloody stand. They would let the Marines in, and then they would close the doors and slaughter them. But they hadn't counted on the one thing that could turn their meticulously planned ambush into a graveyard. A quiet man with a toy gun who was about to show them the true meaning of fear. The trap was sprung with a terrifying suddenness. Frank and his squad were deep inside the labyrinthine tunnel system of Bloody Nose Ridge. They had followed what they thought was a path to a major Japanese command post. Instead, they had stumbled into a massive hidden cavern. As they entered, a heavy wooden door, camouflaged with rock and mud, slid shut behind them. The beam of Frank's flashlight caught the grim faces of a dozen Japanese soldiers, their rifles and submachine guns already raised. There was no escape. The cavern was a natural amphitheater of death, and they were the unwilling audience. A Japanese officer, his face a mask of cold fury, stepped forward. He spoke in a low, guttural Japanese, but his meaning was clear. He was taunting them, telling them they had come to die. He then began to speak in broken English, a triumphant smirk on his face. "You Americans, you fight with big guns, big bombs, but we have courage. We fight with Bushido." He gestured to his men. "Your little pistol, a toy. We will show you how a warrior dies." Frank didn't respond. He just stood there, his Colt in his hand, its weight a familiar comfort. He knew he had a fraction of a second to act. He didn't waste it on a grand speech or a heroic gesture. He simply raised his pistol and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp, violent thunderclap that made the rock walls shake. The Japanese officer's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. A large, gaping hole appeared in his chest, and he fell backward, lifeless, before he hit the ground. The cavern erupted in a storm of gunfire. Frank's men, caught completely off guard, returned fire with their M1s, the long barrels clattering against the rock as they tried to get a clean shot. But the Japanese had the advantage of position and the element of surprise. Frank, however, was in his element. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a close-quarters knife fight in the dark. He dropped to one knee, the Colt barking a steady rhythm. The 45 ACP rounds were hammers, not scalpels. He didn't have to aim for the head. He aimed for the center of mass. Each shot was met with a scream, a thud, and the silence of a man who would never fight again. The Japanese soldiers were firing their Nambu pistols and their Arisaka rifles, but their aim was wild, panicked. The sight of their officer, their leader, falling so quickly, so brutally, had shattered their resolve. A Japanese soldier lunged at Frank with a bayonet. But Frank was already moving, sidestepping the thrust and bringing the Colt up. The man was too close for the rifle. The Colt fired, and the soldier's charge was cut short, a single .45 caliber round hitting him in the chest and stopping him instantly. His bayonet clattered harmlessly to the ground. The cavern became a chaotic ballet of light and shadow, gunfire and screams. Frank was a whirlwind of motion, his Colt an extension of his will. He would see a flash of a helmet, a silhouette against a cave wall, and the Colt would speak. Each shot was a testament to the brutal finality of the 45 round. The Japanese were not just dying. They were being stopped. The Nambu pistols were still chattering, but they were not having the same effect. A Marine would take an 8mm round and keep fighting, wounded but still a threat. A Japanese soldier took a 45 round and the fight was over. He was no longer a factor. He was a memory. The sheer terrifying power of the Colt had turned the tide. The Japanese, who had planned this ambush so meticulously, were now fighting a desperate, panicked retreat. They were not fighting men. They were fighting a force of nature. The battle lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the last shot was fired, the cavern was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the surviving Marines and the low groans of the wounded. Frank stood there, his Colt smoking slightly in his hand. The ground was littered with bodies, and the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder. He had just turned a meticulously planned ambush into a one-sided slaughter. The Japanese had scoffed at the American sidearm. They had called it a toy. Now, in the dark, blood-soaked confines of that cavern, they knew the truth. They knew that the toy was a harbinger of death, a weapon that didn't play by the rules of their battlefield code. It didn't just wound. It ended the fight instantly. It was a lesson they would never forget, and it was a lesson that would change the course of the battle. The Japanese were no longer a monolith of unwavering fanaticism. They had seen the face of their own mortality, and it was a quiet man with a small but terrifying pistol. The myth of the American toy gun was dead, replaced by a grim new reality, and the battle for Peleliu was about to enter its final, brutal phase. The reputation of Sergeant Frank O'Hara and his Colt 45 became a grim legend that spread not just through the Marine ranks but through the Japanese lines as well. The captured Japanese soldiers were no longer scoffing at the American sidearm. They were telling their interrogators stories of the Thunder Gun and the Death Marine who wielded it. The Japanese High Command, initially dismissive, began to issue new orders. They instructed their men to avoid close-quarters combat with the Americans if possible, and to focus their firepower on the American riflemen. They were no longer worried about the Garand in a tunnel. They were terrified of the 45. The psychological effect of the weapon was as devastating as its physical impact. The Japanese code of Bushido, of fighting to the last man, was predicated on the idea that they would meet their end in a blaze of glory. But the Colt 45 didn't allow for a glorious death. It was a swift, brutal finality that left no room for heroics. It was an anti-Bushido weapon, a tool of grim efficiency that shattered their code with every shot. As the battle for Peleliu wore on, the island became a graveyard. The Japanese continued to fight from their entrenched positions, but the confidence was gone. They were no longer the ghosts in the jungle. They were now the prey, and the Marines, led by men like Frank O'Hara, were the hunters. The final assault on the Japanese stronghold on Bloody Nose Ridge was a grueling, protracted affair. The Marines had to clear a series of caves and tunnels, a brutal close-quarters slugfest that was decided in inches, not yards. Frank's squad was tasked with clearing a massive interconnected network of tunnels that was thought to be a final command bunker for General Nakagawa himself. They moved through the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the thick, musty air. The enemy was everywhere, but they were no longer fighting with the same conviction. They were panicked, desperate. They would fire a few shots and then retreat deeper into the labyrinth. Frank led the way, his Colt held steady in his hand. He was no longer the lanky kid from Boston. He was a veteran of 100 small battles, a grim master of close-quarters combat. He was a walking ghost, a silent predator in a world of shadows and echoes. He would fire, and a Japanese soldier would fall. He didn't waste a second shot. He knew the job was done. The 45 round had delivered its final verdict. The sound of the Colt had become a siren song of death for the Japanese. They would hear the distant bark of the pistol, and a tremor of fear would run through their ranks. They knew that when the Colt spoke, the conversation was over. As Frank's squad pushed deeper, they came to a large cave with a makeshift altar. A Japanese officer, surrounded by a handful of his men, stood at the altar, a ceremonial sword in his hand. He saw the Marines and raised his sword, a defiant last stand. But Frank didn't hesitate. He raised his Colt. The officer had a Nambu pistol in his belt, but he didn't even get a chance to reach for it. Frank fired, and the officer fell, his ceremonial sword clattering against the rock floor. He had been a symbol of their code, and he had been felled by the Americans' toy gun. It was a grim, powerful moment, a testament to the old world meeting the new world, and the new world winning with brutal efficiency. The rest of the Japanese soldiers surrendered. They were not fighting for a cause anymore. They were fighting for their lives, and the Colt 45 was a clear and present danger to that. The battle for Peleliu was nearing its end, and the Japanese were finally breaking. General Nakagawa himself had sent his final radio message to his superiors, a grim note of finality. He described the tenacity of the Americans, but he also spoke of the terrible pistol, a weapon that he said was designed for death, not for war. He then burned his regimental flag and committed seppuku. The Japanese had been a nation of warriors who had prided themselves on their honor in death. But the Colt 45 had robbed them of that honor. It had turned their glorious last stands into simple, brutal executions. It was a weapon that said, "There is no glory here. There is only an end." And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The final days of the battle were a mopping-up operation, a methodical, grim clearing of the caves. The Japanese resistance was broken. They were no longer fighting with a fanatical zeal. They were fighting with the grim knowledge that they were fighting a losing battle, not just against the American forces, but against a single, unassuming pistol that had become the most feared weapon on the island. The Colt had not only won the battle, but it had won the psychological war. But the war wasn't over. Not for Frank, and not for the men who had seen what the Colt could do. They knew that the peace they had found on this small island was a fragile thing, and that the world outside was still a dangerous place. The war would continue, and the lessons they had learned on Peleliu about the power of a single, decisive shot would stay with them forever. And for Frank, the Colt would always be more than a weapon. It would be a symbol of a brutal, unforgiving war that had changed him forever. The victory was complete, but the cost was astronomical, and the memory of the Colt's silent finality would haunt them all. The battle for Peleliu was officially declared over on November 27, 1944. The island, once a lush, verdant paradise, was now a scarred, lifeless moonscape. The coral had been pulverized, the trees had been stripped bare, and the ground was pocked with bomb craters and littered with the debris of a brutal war. The casualty count was staggering. Thousands of Americans and more than 10,000 Japanese had lost their lives. The battle had been a proving ground, a brutal, unforgiving test of will and firepower. The M1 Garand had done its job, the flamethrowers had seared their way through the enemy, and the grenades had cleared countless pillboxes. But in the end, it was the unassuming Colt 45 that had become the grim hero of the story. It had turned a close-quarters fight of attrition into a series of swift, brutal decisions. It had shattered the Japanese morale and their code of Bushido. It was no longer a toy gun. It was a symbol of American brutal efficiency. Sergeant Frank Lucky O'Hara survived the battle. He was a changed man. The lanky kid from Boston was gone, replaced by a grim, quiet soldier with a 1,000-yard stare. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on Peleliu, but he never spoke much about it. He knew the truth. He knew that the medal wasn't for his bravery. It was for his brutality. He had become a master of the instant kill, a man who had faced the enemy in the darkest of places and had ended the fight with a single devastating shot. His Colt 45 became a part of him, an extension of his will. He would clean it meticulously, oil it, and hold it in his hand, feeling the familiar weight of it. It was a weapon, but it was also a reminder of the hell he had survived, a reminder of the men he had killed and the men he had saved. After the war, Frank returned to Boston. He tried to go back to his old life, but it was impossible. The war had changed him forever. The sights, the sounds, the smells, they were all a part of him now. The sound of a car backfiring would make him flinch. The sight of a crowded space would make him scan for threats. The memory of the Colt's deafening bark in a dark cave would always be with him. He had faced the grim reality of combat, and he had looked death in the face and won. But the victory had come at a cost. He had lost a piece of his soul on that blood-soaked island. The Colt was a symbol of that loss. It was a tool of his trade, but it was also a grim reminder of the kind of man he had become. A man who had looked at the world through the sights of a pistol and had seen only one thing, an end. The story of the Colt 45 on Peleliu is more than just a footnote in history. It's a powerful testament to the psychological toll of war. It's a story of a weapon that changed the course of a battle, not just with its physical power, but with its psychological power. The Japanese had believed that their code of honor would make them invincible. But the Colt had shown them that there was no honor in a swift, brutal death. There was only a cold, silent finality. The war in the Pacific was a war of ideologies, of cultures, of codes. And the Colt 45, a simple, unassuming pistol, had become the grim final word in that conversation. It had ended the fight instantly, and in doing so, it had created a new kind of legacy, a grim legend of brutal efficiency that would forever be etched in the annals of World War II. It was a final, devastating chapter in the story of a war that had changed the world forever. The legacy of the Colt 45, of that toy gun, would live on, a ghost of a weapon that had become a silent killer, and its most terrifying chapter had been written on the blood-soaked beaches and in the dark, silent caves of Palaleu. The war had ended, but for men like Frank, the war would never truly be over. They would carry the memory of the Colt and the grim lessons it had taught them for the rest of their lives. And as the world moved on, they would remain, the silent sentinels of a past that could never be forgotten. For some, the sound of that pistol was a sound of victory, but for Frank it was a constant, haunting echo of the brutal truth of war.